We're going to look now at the homeland policy, the Bantustans system. This is a bit of a detour from our previous lectures, which were more sort of chronological and event-based. And this is going to be a bit more conceptual in that sense. So the first thing that I'd like us to look at is gender. Now, colonialism in general and apartheid in specific had significant and disproportionate impacts on women, as women suffered both racial and gender discrimination, not only from the colonial government, but also from within resistance organizations. But first, let's focus on the National Party government. Within apartheid, women had few to no legal rights. They had no rights to own property. Jobs were often hard to find for women, harder than for men. Many black and colored women worked as agricultural or domestic workers, but wages were extremely low. There's also the issue of family separation. The controlled movement of blacks and colored workers within the country through the Native Urban Areas Act of 1923, and then later the reference books, these passbook laws, these separated family members from one another because men could prove their employment in urban areas while women were seen as dependents and therefore would not get approval in their passbook, and so they risked being deported to rural areas. So sometimes what you'd have is men who had approval through the passbook system being able to live in urban areas, living not with their family, not with their children, not with their wives, or with their parents in extended family arrangements, but instead men lived in these large dormitories rife with alcohol and violence and infrequent visit homes, all of which further deteriorated women's abilities to be financially solvent, to be financially independent, and to be able to raise their own families. So, an important consideration in considering apartheid and thinking about apartheid is that women were hurt more by apartheid than men. So, these reservations that you can see color coded at left were known as Bantustans. And as you can see, with very few exceptions, these are non-contiguous. They are a bit of an archipelago of colors here. This one here is my cursor. This one here is contiguous, but this one is not. And then because you have a little bit over there, this one certainly is not. This one certainly is not. This one certainly is not. This one is three little sections. So what we're looking at is a system that was established in the 1950s, late 1950s, by Verwoerd. That's spelled Verwoerd, Verwoerd. He established these 9 African groups that you can see in the picture at left. And the idea was each of these territories were to become their own country, to become their own nation. And therefore, if you're a black African, you don't have the right to vote in South Africa and never will in this system because you are a citizen of your homeland. You had only rights and freedoms within your homeland. And outside your homeland, in the rest of what we now think of as South Africa, you are in fact an alien. This land, like the reservation systems for Native Americans in the United States, was poor quality land. Land potentially quite far away from where you grew up, where your ancestors lived. And these territories were completely incapable of supporting large populations. So to make this work I'm putting in quotes here, is you have to create a system of resettlement areas and then movement of people. So I'll give you an example going back here. Let's say, for instance, you lived in Johannesburg or outside Johannesburg and you were black. In this system, your area that did exist here, you're not allowed to live there anymore. So what you have is people being moved to a resettlement area, maybe somewhere adjacent, and then you were moved to the so-called homeland. And this affected 3.5 million South Africans were moved to resettlement areas, um, sometimes being moved out of mixed-race neighborhoods, and sometimes breaking up families as well, where one member would be considered Zulu and one would be considered Ndebele, so husband and wife might be separated. Um, Old neighborhoods were bulldozed and reclaimed as whites-only neighborhoods. You also have this system of black spots. Black spots was an area of land where blacks lived, um, in what the National Party government deemed white South Africa. So it's called black spot, and it's a black spot surrounded by white. And these black spots were places where people may have owned land for generations, bought legally by blacks, either as individuals or groups, and they weren't allowed to live there anymore. So this area they would be forced out of without compensation, and that area would be demolished, and they would be moved to resettlement areas. And I think I have a photo of what these resettlement areas look like. So we really need to see this forced removals and grand apartheid system is as a case of social engineering. Social engineering around fictitious notions of race and ethnicity. We also need to see it as a government-created refugee crisis. So, social engineering and as a refugee crisis. Just a quick note about this photograph. This photograph was taken in 1982, so a few decades after the time period we're talking about. So this continued on for some time. Once people were moved into these so-called Bantustans, many women lost incomes that they had earned in urban areas. So maybe they were a maid or a housekeeper or a cook in a white family's home, or working to support the black community in some way. They may have lost their incomes and therefore become more reliant on wage earners, the wage of male migrants. So this further split up families as men began to leave home to work as laborers in cities or in the mines. We also need to look at the economic effect of the Group Areas Act, in the fact that this heightened economic class divisions. The Homeland Policy heightened, or that is to say, made worse economic class divisions. Not only did it make non-whites poor, but it led directly to the creation of white wealth. So what you would have is people being forced out of an area, and then that area would be deemed a white area, and then it's effectively gentrified. So in Cape Town, there were a number of suburbs like Harford Village that were basically people were forced to sell their homes or forced out of their home through intimidation and fear of law. So you get that territory for free or close to free. And then it's able to be developed by speculators and developers. And homes for whites, suburbs for whites are put in. And this leads to enormous profit for buyers and sellers of property. And the creation of a sort of a suburbia dream for white South Africaners. And we need to remember this is in the late 50s, 60s, all the way through the 80s. One of the most famous examples is the destruction of Sophiatown. It looks to us like it's Sophiatown, but it was pronounced Sophiatown. Sophiatown was a vibrant community in the center of arts and cultural life. It had a symbolic importance to all black South Africans, well beyond its population number of about 65,000. It was the musical and cultural center of Black South Africa. Think of Harlem for Black Americans. So Sophiatown was seen as a black spot. Homes were destroyed, as you can see in this image here, to make room for brand new white developments. What happened here was Sophiatown was destroyed, and the new Afrikaner suburb of Triumph was put in. It was perhaps Triumph, but Triumph was put in. There's a connection here to Portland. In Portland, in the 1960s, you have the destruction of the Albina neighborhood in North Portland for the widening of I-5. You have the construction of the Memorial Coliseum, the expansion, of I-5 and 99, which is now MLK and Grand Avenue. That happened in the 50s. The Rose Quarter in the 60s. The expansion of Emmanuel Hospital in the 1970s. And this led to half of Albina, half of the neighborhood's black population was forced to relocate. The photograph you see here is, I think, from 1973, from Emmanuel Hospital's expansion and destruction of black neighborhoods. We need to see both the Sophiatown case and the North Portland case as similar cases. We need to see the Sophiatown case and the North Portland cases as the consequence of the same thing. And it's a consequence of one group having economic, social, and legal power, and the other group not having economic, social, and legal power. So what we see in Portland is similar to what we see in Sophiatown. One group being forced out because they lack economic, social, and legal capital, and another group benefiting from it. Okay, that wraps up our look at Bantustans, Group Areas Act, and forced removals. Our next video, we'll be looking at the bus boycotts.